Today in federal court in Washington, D.C., they finished jury selection and started opening statements in the trial of the president's longtime friend and oldest political advisor, a man who has gone to great lengths to make him seem too ridiculous for serious news coverage, a man named Roger Stone. Now, whether or not you are interested in Mr. Stone himself, and speaking from personal experience, I can say that interest is hard to sustain on a personal level. No offense, I just don't care. But the reason Mr. Stone is being prosecuted and the way prosecutors are carrying out this case that started today in federal court is like, forget Roger Stone. I mean, yes, his criminal liability here is of interest, but forget Roger Stone. The case is about something way bigger than that. And we had known that was a possibility when we first saw the charges against Stone and the way they laid out the case against him in the indictment. But I did not expect it to be like this in court today. Just listen to this. We got the transcript today. I had no faith we would get it in time for tonight's show, same day that it happened, right? But just before I came down to the studio and we got on the air tonight, we got the transcript of what happened today in court. And so I have marked it up. This might be a little rocky because we haven't had it for very long. But let me just lay it out here in terms of how the prosecutors are making this case, because you can tell what it's about. And you do not have to care about Roger Stone to recognize that this is a big, freaking, hairy deal. All right. Here's how the opening statement starts. The judge says, all right, you can proceed. She says that to the prosecutor, Aaron Zelinsky. And now this is Aaron Zelinsky talking. You may recognize his name. He was one of the prosecutors who worked on the Mueller investigation. Here's Zelinsky. He says, quote, "We are here today because one man obstructed Congress's investigation into Russian interference in the 2016 election. In a critical investigation of national importance, the defendant, Roger Stone, repeatedly lied under oath to a congressional committee and then tampered with a witness to cover up his tracks." Now, you'll hear that in 2016, the Democratic National Committee, which is the organization that runs the Democratic Party in the United States, they announced that their computer system had been hacked by the Russian government. You'll hear that not long after that, a website called WikiLeaks began to release thousands of emails that were related to the DNC. After WikiLeaks began releasing these DNC emails, you'll also hear that the defendant, Roger Stone, started bragging that he was in contact with WikiLeaks and he knew what WikiLeaks' plans were. At the time, the defendant's longtime friend and associate, Donald Trump, was running for president of the United States against Hillary Clinton. And the defendant, Roger Stone, thought that those emails would help his friend Trump and they would hurt Clinton. So you'll hear in August of 2016 that Mr. Stone proclaimed over and over and over again that he was in contact with WikiLeaks and that he had information about what was coming. And you'll hear that Mr. Stone publicly said that he knew this information because he had an intermediary, a go-between, somebody that he was talking to that was talking to the head of WikiLeaks. 1 year later, you'll hear that the United States Congress, in particular the House Intelligence Committee, was undertaking an investigation into Russian interference in the 2016 election. And because of the allegation that Russia was responsible for the hacking of the DNC's server and the emails that were subsequently released by WikiLeaks, the Intelligence Committee focused on WikiLeaks and they focused on Roger Stone. And the Intelligence Committee wanted to know what information Stone had gotten from WikiLeaks, how he'd gotten it, and who he was talking to on the Trump campaign about it. Now, Roger Stone, you'll hear, testified before the committee under oath on September 26, 2017. And you'll hear that when Mr. Stone testified, he told the committee 5 categories of lies. So that's the preamble. That's how he starts. In terms of the 5 categories of lies, Stone is facing 7 felony counts altogether. One of them, very serious, is witness tampering. That carries a 20-year potential prison term. I'll just mention that just in case any members of the United States Senate are listening right now. Witness tampering carries a potential 20-year prison term. In addition to that, he's facing 5 counts of lying to Congress and a count of obstruction of justice. Each of those comes with 5 potential years of their own. But the prosecution goes through, at the outset, all of the categories of lies that Roger Stone is alleged to have told under oath. First category is this. The second category is this. The third category is this. And then the final category of lies that they describe him as telling is this, quote, "The last lie Roger Stone told the committee was about the Trump campaign. He was asked by the committee whether he had ever discussed what he learned from his intermediary with the Trump campaign. And Roger Stone told them he hadn't." You will hear that Roger Stone discussed what he was learning with the senior levels of the Trump campaign. Now, you might ask, why didn't Roger Stone just tell the truth to the House Intelligence Committee? The evidence in this case will show that Stone lied to the Intelligence Committee because the truth looked bad. The truth looked bad for the Trump campaign, and the truth looked bad for and the truth looked bad for Donald Trump. So this is a case about Roger Stone. But the prosecution made clear today in their opening statement that the reason Stone lied in the prosecutor's telling, the reason he's on trial right now for these felony counts is because he couldn't tell the truth because, and I quote, the truth looked bad for Donald Trump. This is a case about the president. I mean, it's about Roger Stone, but it's about the president. And it's in part, while the House is already in the midst of impeachment proceedings against the president, this case that started today in criminal court in Washington is about, in part, whether President Trump's sworn written statements about Roger Stone were true. Whether his sworn written statements about what he knew about what Stone was doing, whether he was any part of that. This case, in part, is about whether the president's written answers might themselves have been illegal false statements. Back to Zelensky here. Quote, just after Stone got this message about new expected dumps of stolen information about the Democrats, Roger Stone emailed the chairman of the Trump campaign, Paul Manafort. Paul Manafort wasn't just the chairman of the Trump campaign. He was also a longtime friend of Roger Stone. Stone wrote to Manafort on August 3rd that he had an idea, in his words, to, forgive me, save Trump's ass. And he asked that Manafort call him. You'll also hear that Roger Stone emailed the Trump campaign's CEO, Steve Bannon. And when Stone emailed Bannon, he told Bannon that Trump could still win, but time was running out. And he said he knew how to win this, but, quote, it ain't pretty. Roger Stone knew how to win this, and he was telling that to the Trump campaign CEO, but his way, in his own words, quote, ain't pretty. Now, at that same time in August, you'll hear Roger Stone was bragging. He was bragging publicly, and he was bragging loudly, and he was bragging repeatedly that he was in contact with WikiLeaks, that he had a go-between that was telling him information about what was coming, that he had an intermediary. Stone regularly updated people on the Trump campaign at the senior levels about whatever information he thought he had about WikiLeaks. Now, make no mistake, Roger Stone could easily have told the truth to the Intelligence Committee. Stone could have testified that he had many emails and messages and texts about WikiLeaks and Julian Assange, including the ones you've seen here today. He could have said he had many messages with Steve Bannon, with Paul Manafort, with Randy Critico, with Jerome Corsi about Julian Assange. Roger Stone could have told the truth that he told Corsi to get to Assange and get the pending WikiLeaks emails, and that he then told Corsi to have an associate of theirs get to Julian Assange. And Roger Stone could have told the House Intelligence Committee the truth, that in fact Corsi had responded back to him and told him that there would be, quote, dumps coming in October, impact planned to be very damaging. And Stone could have told the committee he had all of this in writing in his email accounts and his text messages at the time of his testimony. Stone could have told the committee the truth, that he asked to pass along a question to Julian Assange, that he requested information from Assange about whether or not he had emails concerning Hillary Clinton and Libya. And Stone could have told the committee that he spoke with Steve Bannon and others about what he was learning regarding WikiLeaks. Stone could have truthfully stated that he had hundreds of messages, emails, texts that would show the truth of what happened in 2016, that he had many written records that could help the committee to establish what had actually happened. But Roger Stone didn't do that. He didn't even come close. Instead, he repeatedly lied to the House Intelligence Committee. He did it because if he had told the truth, as he said before, it wasn't pretty. It would look bad. And so, instead, he told these lies. Roger Stone did all of this to obstruct an investigation by the House Intelligence Committee into Russian interference in the 2016 election. The committee was undertaking a critical investigation about an important moment in our nation's history. The House Intelligence Committee was trying to learn the truth about what had happened in the 2016 election. And Roger Stone, he was doing his best to stop it. And that is why, after you have listened to all the evidence in this case, and you have examined the documents and heard the witnesses, we are confident that you will return the only verdict justified on these facts, a verdict of guilty on all counts. Thank you. So the president's being impeached. Just in the past few minutes, I am advised that the Washington Post has just reported that the president asked the Attorney General, Bill Barr, to hold a press conference saying the president did nothing wrong on the president's phone call to Ukraine, for which he's now being impeached. The Attorney General, yes, that Attorney General, Bill Barr, according to the Washington Post tonight, reportedly turned the president down and said he would not hold such a press conference. Also tonight, the president's personal lawyer has just hired his own criminal defense lawyer. Same defense lawyer the president's first personal lawyer used to have, but he's freed up now because the other guy who used to be the president's personal lawyer is already in prison, so his lawyers are available. The public impeachment hearings are going to start next week. And in a courtroom in Washington, D.C., as of today, prosecutors are finally litigating for the first time not just the obstruction of the Russia investigation, right? But for the first time, they are finally litigating what the president knew about Russia's interference to help his campaign and when he knew it. They are finally litigating that question while he's already being impeached for something else. Other than that, totally normal Wednesday, right? We'll be right back. Stay with us.
Hey there, I'm Chris Hayes from MSNBC. Thanks for watching MSNBC on YouTube. If you want to keep up to date with the videos we're putting out, you can click subscribe just below me or click over on this list to see lots of other great videos.